They always say you'll remember the exact moment your life changes, the way the air felt, the precise sound of someone's voice, the way time seems to bend just enough to let it all sink in. For me, it was a Thursday morning, just after 9 a.m., when the life I had built with careful, loyal hands was ripped from under me, not with fanfare, not with an explosion, but with a smile, a practiced, hollow smile. "Myra, I'm going to have to let you go." No warning, no preamble, just that. Like he was commenting on the weather. "My name is Myra Ellison. I'm 47 years old, and I've been a senior operations coordinator at Halston Crest, a boutique logistics firm in downtown Chicago, for just over 20 years. I'm the kind of person who learns everyone's name, shows up early even on snowy days, and remembers who drinks tea instead of coffee. I don't half-ass anything. I built my entire adult life around that job, the rhythms of it, the routines, the quiet pride of doing things right. And just like that, Mark Thompson, my boss of 6 years, the man who shook my hand when I won the company loyalty award 3 years in a row, looked me in the eye and told me it was over. The office was quiet when he said it. Everyone else had filed in for the day, but our corner conference room was shut. I remember how sterile the place looked, like it had been bleached of all the years I'd spent laughing, solving problems, staying late, training interns who didn't know the difference between a shipping manifest and a sales invoice. He didn't even offer a seat, just stood there awkwardly with a thin manila folder on the glass table. "Is this a joke?" I asked, because that was the only thing I could think to say. My voice didn't tremble, I didn't cry, I just stared at him, as if by sheer force of will I could push the words back into his mouth. "I wish it were. There have been structural changes," he said, as if reading off a script. "We're having to downsize significantly." "Downsize," I repeated, still not moving. "You're cutting the person who practically built your operations team?" Mark didn't flinch. He wasn't the flinching type. I'd always respected that about him. His cool, collected nature. But that morning, I saw something else behind his calm. Relief. Not guilt, not sadness. Relief, like a man crossing something unpleasant off a to-do list. "I don't understand," I said quietly. "No meetings, no conversations. After 20 years, I don't even get a heads up." "I'm sorry, Myra," he said. And now he looked at his watch. This wasn't easy for any of us. That's when I knew. This wasn't a company decision, this was his decision. And it wasn't sudden. He'd planned this. It took everything in me to walk out of that building with my head up, not to throw the coffee mug off my desk, not to scream in the middle of the elevators. I'd seen others let go over the years, always with at least a few weeks of notice, severance packages, goodbye cards, the obligatory cake in the break room. Not this time. I wasn't even allowed back at my desk. HR had already boxed up my things. A security guard I didn't recognize handed me a cardboard box like I was being evicted. No one looked at me when I walked through the floor. I caught Julie, the new project manager, glancing away as I passed her. She knew, or she'd been told not to get involved. When the elevator doors shut behind me, I just stood there, surrounded by the faint scent of old toner and the quiet whir of moving floors, holding a box that might as well have been my whole identity in 12 inches of recycled cardboard. I didn't cry until I was in the car, not even when I got home to the apartment I'd lived in for 11 years. Not when I placed the box on the kitchen table like some strange artifact from another life. It was later that evening, after I'd sat in silence for hours, staring at the framed photo of our old team holiday party, the one where we wore those dumb red sweaters and Mark gave me a bottle of wine with a Post-it that said, "To the real engine behind this place." That was when the first tear slid down. And it wasn't sadness, it was rage, confusion too, a low festering sense of something not making sense. I kept replaying our last few weeks together in my mind. The tension in his voice during staff meetings, the way he started CCing other people on emails he used to send just to me, the moment I asked him about an expense report that didn't add up, and he brushed it off with a half laugh. God, that expense report. It was small, barely even a blip in our system, a consulting fee that seemed odd, vague description, a company name I didn't recognize. When I brought it up to him in January, he waved it away. Just a temporary contractor, he'd said. "Don't waste your time digging." I didn't think much of it then, but now, in the suffocating quiet of my living room, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About all the little things that had felt off in the past 6 months, the sudden reassignments, the files going missing from our shared drive, the abrupt cancellation of the quarterly audit I had pushed for. I opened my laptop. I didn't know what I was looking for, not exactly, but I started with the name from that invoice, Corin Solutions. It was listed as a vendor on a $12,000 payment. I remembered it because I'd had to fix the GL coding manually, but when I Googled the name, nothing. No website, no LinkedIn page, no business registration in Illinois. I dug deeper, clicking through cache directories, trying variations of the name. Eventually, I found something. A shell company tied to a Delaware P.O. box, registered just last year, a couple of tax-related links, and a blurry PDF of a generic invoice format, eerily similar to the one I saw in our records. My heart started to pound. Why would our company, a logistics firm with zero outsourcing needs, be paying a fake vendor? Who signed off on the expense? Mark. Every time. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't just a termination. This was a cover-up. Over the next few days, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was still trying to wrap my head around what was happening. I applied for a few jobs, half-heartedly, but my mind kept circling back to the files, the transactions, the carefully buried traces of something rotten underneath the surface of Halston Crest. And something else happened. A former coworker, Emily, messaged me on LinkedIn. She said she was sorry to hear what happened, that she didn't understand why they let me go. They said it was budget cuts, she wrote, but they just hired another junior manager. Something's off. That message lit something in me, a quiet fire I didn't even realize had been building. This wasn't just betrayal, this was fraud. And he'd thought I'd walk away quietly, that I'd disappear. That 20 years of building systems, writing protocols, monitoring accounts, that I wouldn't notice, but I had. And I kept records. There's a strange clarity that comes after devastation. When the noise dies down and you've cried all the tears you're going to cry, what's left is focus, sharp, bitter, and clean. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not Emily, not even my sister, who had been calling every evening since I lost the job to check in on me, gently suggesting that maybe I needed some time to reset. I didn't need time, I needed answers. I'd spent the better part of my adult life building operational scaffolding at Halston Crest. I knew every policy, every password convention, every quarterly schedule, and who signed W-HAT. I designed half of it. I knew where to look. That week, I started digging, quietly, carefully. I still had access to a personal backup, a habit I'd developed years ago after a minor system crash wiped out 2 weeks of my work. I'd never stopped keeping mirrored folders on a private encrypted drive. It wasn't anything sensitive, not confidential client data or employee records, but enough to recreate my notes, email trails, procedural outlines, expense summaries. It was more than enough. The more I pieced together, the clearer the pattern became. Mark had been funneling money through at least 3 shell vendors over the past year, all small charges tucked under discretionary budgets, labeled innocuously, consultant services, vendor logistics support, market research, the kind of things that would never raise flags unless someone was looking closely, and no one had been, because I'd been the one keeping the house in order, until I got too close. That invoice from Corin Solutions, that was the slip-up. The description was slightly different from the others, sloppier. It listed a vague project title, Phase 3 Rollout Consulting, something we hadn't had on the docket for over 2 years. When I searched our internal project database, the code didn't even exist. He wasn't just embezzling, he was getting lazy, and that made him dangerous. One evening, I took a long walk along the lake. The wind whipped my coat open, and I didn't bother fixing it. I just walked, trying to figure out what kind of story this was becoming. I wasn't a crusader. I didn't want to burn the place down, but I couldn't let him get away with it, not after what he did to me. It wasn't just the firing. It was the calculation behind it, the way he'd used my loyalty as a shield while he played his own game behind closed doors. I'd defended him. I'd covered for him when he was late to meetings, when he missed quarterly reviews. I'd stay yed when the company went through 2 ownership transitions because I believed in the team, in him, and he'd discarded me the moment I became a threat. I knew the right play wasn't a dramatic confrontation. That wouldn't end well. Mark was charismatic. He always had been. People liked him. He could spin anything into a polished speech, drop a few buzzwords, and people would nod along. No, I needed something airtight, objective, something he couldn't talk his way out of. I started cataloging the payments, copying each expense report I'd saved, building a timeline, noting approval chains, and matching it with project activity. It was slow work, but it filled the space where anger used to be. Every hour I spent was a brick laid in something solid, something real, but I knew I couldn't do it alone. That's when I thought of Carla Weston. She'd left Halston Crest a year ago, quietly, without much notice. She'd been head of compliance, smart, cautious, a little cynical. We'd gotten along, but we weren't close. Still, I remembered how unsettled she seemed toward the end. There were whispers she'd butted heads with someone. She never said who. I found her email buried in an old thread about onboarding protocols. I typed and retyped the message 3 times before I hit send. Carla, I know it's been a while and I hope you're doing well. I'm reaching out because I need to ask you something. And I promise I wouldn't if it wasn't important. I was let go from Halston Crest last week. No notice, no severance. The official line was downsizing. But I think you and I both know that place has its share of secrets. I'm looking into a series of payments that don't add up. Shell vendors, hidden consulting fees. I believe Mark was involved, and I believe I was removed because I was starting to get too close. Did you ever see anything like that before you left? I won't share anything. Ing, you say, I just need to know I'm not crazy. Myra, she responded that night, Myra, you're not crazy. I saw it. Or at least part of it. I flagged a series of inconsistencies in Q4 last year. Mark pushed back hard. Too hard. The next month, I was told my position was being restructured. I still have copies of the flagged reports. We should talk, not over email. Can you meet? We met the next day in a quiet cafe, 2 neighborhoods away from where either of us lived. Carla looked older, more tired, but her eyes were still sharp. I always suspected there was more to it, she said, as she slid a USB drive across the table. I couldn't prove anything, but now that you're saying it, it makes sense. We spent 2 hours comparing notes, and the pieces started falling into place like a bad puzzle. You suddenly realize it's actually a map. The shell companies weren't just fake, they were connected. 2 of them had identical EIN filing patterns, and one had a business address that, after a little searching, turned out to be tied to Mark's cousin's firm in Detroit, a fake consulting chain. A closed loop of money moving through fake vendors with no real services provided. It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. What's your plan? Carla asked as we packed up. I hesitated. Not sure yet, but I'm not walking away, not this time. Good, she said. Just be careful. Mark's not stupid. If he thinks you're on to him, he'll come after you. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I paced the apartment, thinking through every move. I knew I couldn't go to HR. Mark had them wrapped around his finger. And legal, the company's legal team answered to the executive board, which conveniently Mark had recently been added to as a strategic advisor. No, I needed outside help, and I had just the contact in mind. Years ago, I worked with a woman named Nadine Roy, a forensic accountant who freelanced for us during a messy vendor dispute. Brilliant, meticulous, she owed me a favor. I he'd out, explained the situation vaguely, and she agreed to meet. Within 48 hours, Nadine had reviewed the reports and confirmed my suspicions. This is classic laundering behavior, she said. Money routed through intermediaries, false invoices, same metadata across different companies. Whoever did this knew enough to hide the basics, but not enough to mask the patterns. If you present this to the right people, it's damning. The right people, I repeated. You mean law enforcement? She nodded. or the IRS. Either way, it's not something you whisper about in boardrooms. My stomach twisted. This was real now, bigger than personal betrayal. I was holding something dangerous, something that could collapse a career, maybe more. And still, I hesitated. There was a part of me that wanted closure without chaos, that wanted to confront Mark face to face, make him see what he'd done, make him squirm. But I knew better. This wasn't about confrontation. This was about control, strategy. And so I made a decision. I sent an anonymous tip to the State Financial Crimes Unit, complete with the flagged documents, timelines, and payment trails. I used a private relay, no names. I didn't need credit. I didn't need headlines. I just needed the truth to do what it always eventually does, come to light. The next morning, I sat by my window with a cup of coffee, the first one I'd truly tasted since the day he fired me. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how long it would take. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Mark Thompson thought he'd buried me, but he forgot something important. I was the one who built the foundation. It started with a rumor, a quiet whisper from a friend of a friend still working at Halston Crest. Something about compliance officers visiting the office. Something about Mark canceling meetings. Something about a tense, closed-door session that lasted almost 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon. I didn't react at first. Rumors have a way of mutating on their way down the grapevine. But that night, Carla called. "You did it," she said. My hand tightened around the phone. "What do you mean?" "They're being audited, external, full scope, not internal review, not some HR slap on the wrist. Financial Crimes Division. Someone brought real evidence." I didn't say anything. "You didn't hear it from me," she added quickly. "But, Myra, this is bigger than even I thought." I hung up with my heart thudding against my ribs like it wanted out. I should have felt satisfied, relieved, maybe even vindicated. But what I felt, if I'm being honest, was fear. Not the kind that makes you freeze, but the kind that sharpens everything. That ancient, quiet knowing in your blood that says, "You've been seen." I spent the next few days moving like a shadow, trying to keep out of the way, but watching closely. More whispers came, this time from Emily, the project manager who had once looked away when I passed her desk with my box. He's been in his office with the door shut all day. Haven't seen him eat. HR's acting weird too. I think something's happening, but no one knows what exactly. Half the office is paranoid. They're pulling files from the cloud archive 2 years back. Legal's here today, full team. "Myra, did you—" I never answered her. It wasn't pride or secrecy. I just didn't want to pull anyone else into the weight of it. Because the deeper I looked, the more I realized Mark hadn't acted alone. It came to me late one night looking over one of Nadine's detailed financial reports. It wasn't the transactions themselves that tripped me up. It was who had signed off on the secondary approvals. Shelley Barrett, head of strategy, smiled like a politician and always left meetings early with a joke about traffic. I remembered a conversation we had in the copy room 6 months ago. She'd said, "God, I don't know how you keep up with all this documentation. If I had your brain, I'd run to his place." I'd laughed at the time. It didn't seem odd. Now it did. Shelley's name was on at least 3 approval chains. She had rubber-stamped a set of payments that were routed through another shell company, Brightline Advisory, the one Carla hadn't been able to trace. I did. It was tied to a West Loop address, but the suite didn't exist. The building was a shared co-working space, and the bank it routed to, Cayman Islands. This wasn't just sloppy accounting. It was a deliberate, multinational laundering scheme, the kind people go to prison for, quietly, permanently. And I knew now. Mark wasn't just protecting himself when he fired me. He was protecting all of them. I stared out the window of my apartment for a long time that night. Chicago looked smaller from high up. All those buildings and lots, full of people going about their lives, completely unaware of the secrets festering behind glass and concrete and smiles and meetings. I wondered how many other people knew, how many looked the other way. And then I wondered something scarier. What if they hadn't planned to fire me at all? What if the only reason they did was because I asked too many questions? And Mark panicked. What if the plan had been to use me as the fall person, the perfect scapegoat? 20 years in operations. Who better to blame if the books ever caught fire? That thought stayed with me like a splinter under skin. They didn't just discard me, they almost buried me. The next morning, I went back to Nadine with what I'd found. I need this verified. I told her. All of it. She didn't even blink. You got more than enough to bring to a federal prosecutor. Not yet, I said. It's still just dots. I need lines. So we mapped them. Over 3 long days, we built a timeline, month by month, payment by payment. Every shell company, every recipient, every signature that connected the money from Halston Crest's corporate accounts to offshore funds, false invoices, and ghost projects that never happened. We tied in a whistleblower clause under Sarbanes-Oxley. We anonymized employee names where needed, and I documented everything in plain language that even a tired, overworked federal agent could understand at a glance. And when we had it all, we sent it in. This time not anonymously. My name was on the file. I didn't sleep much after that, not because I was afraid of being found out, but because I was waiting for a knock on the door, a call, a message from someone trying to scare me off, but nothing came. And then finally it happened. Carla called again. They're cleaning house, she whispered. Mark's been suspended, Shelley too. No one knows what's happening exactly, but the board issued a statement. Internal investigation pending legal counsel. Myra, they know all of it. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat in silence. It wasn't joy I felt. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was relief. Like someone had been pressing a pillow over my face for a year. And suddenly I could breathe again. The fallout made the news 3 days later. A minor headline in the business section. Executive suspensions at Halston Crest amid allegations of financial misconduct. There were no names yet, but I didn't need them. The article mentioned credible evidence submitted by a former senior employee. That was enough. I poured a glass of wine and read it 3 times before finally closing my laptop. I didn't know what would happen next, if charges would be filed, if the company would survive. That wasn't my concern anymore. They had made a mistake. They underestimated me. They thought firing me would erase the past 20 years. But they forgot. I don't forget. The call came on a Wednesday morning. I just sat down with my coffee, not expecting anything but a few quiet hours of peace. My phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize, DC area code. For a moment, I hesitated. Hen, I answered. Myra Ellison? Yes. This is Special Agent Charles Renner with the Financial Crimes Division of the Department of Justice. Do you have a moment to speak? That voice, measured, formal, but not unkind. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, like I was standing at the edge of something too steep to see the bottom of. Yes, I said. I do. The call lasted 42 minutes. Agent Renner thanked me for the report. He confirmed that the evidence I'd submitted had formed the basis for an active investigation, one that now spanned multiple jurisdictions and was being handled jointly with the IRS and a federal financial oversight task force. He didn't give details, couldn't, but I could read between the lines. They weren't just looking at Halston Crest, they were looking at the entire web, every vendor, every co-conspirator. And then he said something that stuck with me long after we hung up. I want you to understand, Ms. Ellison. Whistleblowing like this, it's rare. Most people don't do what you did. They either walk away or get paid to stay quiet. You did neither. I didn't say anything for a beat. Then, quietly, I didn't do it to be brave. I know, he said. But you were. A week passed, then 2. The news grew louder. Mark Thompson's name finally made it to print. The board issued a statement full of legalese and empty assurances. Shelley Barrett was placed on indefinite leave. An interim CEO was announced, and then came the leak. I don't know who gave the documents to the press. Maybe someone inside legal, maybe a junior employee tired of watching the people at the top get away with everything. But they got out, redacted emails, financial reports, internal memos from Mark himself. One line in particular was everywhere. Ellison's been digging. If she puts the pieces together, we're exposed. That sentence changed everything. Suddenly, and I wasn't just a faceless former employee, I was the woman they tried to silence. Journalists started calling. Former colleagues messaged me privately. some apologizing, some stunned, some pretending they'd always had my back. And just like that, I went from invisible to central. I didn't speak to the media. I had no interest in becoming a public symbol. I'd spent my life in the background, making things run, keeping the gears oiled. I wasn't about to turn this into a stage play, but one call I did take, from someone I never expected to hear from again. My old mentor, Gerald Beckman. He had retired 5 years ago, right before Mark took over the company. Gerald was the kind of leader you never forget. Steady, honest, never flashy. He taught me half of what I know about operations and the other half about integrity. He'd heard the news, wanted to meet. We sat in a quiet diner on the south side, same place we used to grab breakfast before quarterly reviews. He looked older now, gray streaking through his beard, hands a little slower as he stirred his coffee. "I always knew you had steel in you," he said. "But I didn't know you had fire, too." I smiled, small. "I didn't either, until they lit the match." He shook his head. "You were the glue in that place, Myra, and they thought they could rip you out and keep it standing. That was their first mistake." I wanted to believe that. Part of me still wondered if the company would survive this. Part of me still cared. And another part, the quieter, newer part, didn't. "Any idea what you'll do next?" he asked. That question hit differently than it had before. When I was first fired, it felt like an existential crisis. Now, it felt like an open door. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I know I'm not going back." Gerald nodded. "Good. You're not meant to fix their mess anymore. Maybe it's time you build something of your own." Later that night, I opened an old notebook, one I hadn't touched since the pandemic. Inside were led thoughts from late nights, ideas for better operational systems, ethical consulting models, transparent vendor audits. At the time, it felt like a pipe dream. Now, maybe not. I spent the next few weeks in a strange limbo. I wasn't employed. I wasn't exactly unemployed either. I was something else, watching the aftershocks of a storm I had helped set into motion. Mark was indicted 3 weeks later. Wire fraud, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, obstruction. I read the indictment twice, barely breathing. He'd hired a PR firm, of course, issued a statement through his lawyer about being confident in his eventual exoneration. But everyone knew the evidence was too loud, too detailed. One thing, though, still didn't sit right. If Mark was the architect and Shelley was his partner, who else knew? Who else helped? The financial trail showed approvals, but someone had built the system to hide them. Someone with back-end access, someone in IT. So I kept digging, quietly, cautiously. Not to burn more bridges, but because I needed the full truth. Closure doesn't come with partial stories. I reached out to a former systems admin I trusted, Peter. Kind, awkward, brilliant. We used to share bad coffee during upgrades at 3 a.m. He owed me no loyalty, but he met me anyway. We talked in his garage, surrounded by wires and server parts. When I asked him directly, his face changed. "Myra," he said, "I didn't help them, but I knew, not all of it. Just enough to know something was wrong. Why didn't you say anything?" He looked down at his hands. "Because I have 2 kids. Because I needed the paycheck. Because I thought if I just ignored it, maybe someone else would deal with it." He looked back up, eyes wet. "And you did." I didn't judge him. I couldn't. People survive however they can. But it made something clear. This wasn't just a crime of ambition. It was a crime of silence, of complicity, of good people looking away because speaking up felt like throwing themselves off a cliff. The system had made cowards of them, and I had almost been one too. Almost. When the subpoenas started rolling out, I stayed quiet. Let the legal process run its course. I wasn't needed anymore. The evidence spoke for itself. And one morning, I woke up and realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not because justice had been served, not yet, but because I had done what I came to do. I had fought back not with rage, but with truth, with receipts, with strategy. And now, I was free, really free. That afternoon, I emailed Carla, Nadine, and Peter. Subject line, starting something new. I told them I was thinking of building a firm, a small one, ethical consulting, compliance-focused, helping small businesses spot fraud before it takes root, helping whistleblowers navigate risk, helping people like us. I told them I wasn't asking for a commitment, just thoughts. All three responded within an hour. We're in. There was a silence after the storm. Not peace, not yet, but something close. The world didn't stop spinning just because Mark Thompson had finally been held accountable. Halston Crest carried on, limping through restructures and boardroom apologies. The press moved on, the headlines faded, but I wasn't interested in watching the wreckage anymore. I was building something better. We called it Vera Point Consulting, Vera from the Latin for truth. Point because we weren't interested in circles, just clean, direct paths forward. Carla came on as head of compliance strategy. Nadine managed forensic auditing. Peter, bless his cautious, brilliant soul, signed on as a systems integrity specialist. We were a lean team, built from scars and hard-earned experience. We knew how companies broke. We knew where corruption hid, and we knew how to shine a light in the right places the right way. It started with 2 clients, both small logistics startups trying to avoid the messes we'd once waded through. I walked them through how to build our systems with transparency from day one, how to create structures of accountability that didn't rely on trust, but on visibility. It wasn't glamorous. There were no big paydays, no front-page articles, but it was honest, and it was ours. Still, the past wasn't quite done with me. One Friday morning, nearly 3 months after the indictment, I received a certified letter, no sender listed, inside a subpoena, not a threat, a request to testify, federal hearing, grand jury. I read it 3 times in silence. My hands were steady. My heart was not. I called Carla first. She didn't sound surprised. "They're closing in," she said. "This means they're building a formal case, and they want you to walk them through it." "I already gave them everything," I said. "Not everything," she replied quietly. "Not your voice." The courthouse smelled like dust and pine cleaner. Too cold, too still. I sat outside the hearing room for nearly an hour before they called my name. Inside, the space was dim, clinical, like a doctor's office with fewer windows and more consequences. I raised my hand, swore the oath, and sat down in front of 12 people I didn't know, who now held the power to decide whether the truth I had lived through was worth believing. They asked questions. Straightforward at first, timeline, role, responsibilities. Then, when did you first suspect financial misconduct? What was your relationship to Mr. Thompson? Why do you believe you were terminated? How did you gain access to the backup records? Were you aware your actions could have legal consequences? I answered them all calmly, honestly. I didn't posture or dramatize. I told the story the way it happened. The warning signs I ignored, the fear I felt, the cold conference room where everything ended. And then I said this: I was loyal. For 20 years, I gave them everything. I trained 3 generations of staff. I pulled late nights, missed holidays. I believed in that company like it was my own family. So when I found out what they were doing, it didn't feel like justice I wanted. It felt like truth, like a wound that needed to be cleaned, not covered. The room was quiet for a long time after that. They thanked me, told me I could go, that someone would be in touch. I walked out into the afternoon sun, blinking like I hadn't seen real light in weeks. Outside the courthouse, a woman I didn't recognize was waiting. She was in her late 30s, business casual, holding a notepad. Press, I figured. You're Myra Ellison, right? I paused. Yes. I'm not here for a quote, she said quickly. I just wanted to say, I followed your case, the leak, the reports, what you did. People like me don't usually get to see people like you win. People like me? She gave a small smile. Quiet ones. The ones who build everything but don't get noticed until something breaks. I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I nodded and walked away. That night, I didn't work. I didn't plan. I didn't write another process map or follow up on a vendor audit. I opened a bottle of wine, sat on my balcony, and watched the lights of the city move like a slow river through glass towers. And I thought about power, how easy it is to give it away. Piece by piece, over years, you stay late. You don't speak up. You nod when something feels wrong. You make yourself smaller to keep the peace. And how hard it is to take it back, not with anger, not with explosions, but with patience, with strategy, with truth. My phone buzzed just before midnight. It was a message from Emily. They're shutting down the old department. Whole ops team is being restructured. People are scared, but they're also grateful. Just thought you should know. I stared at the message a long time. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase what they'd done to me, but it mattered. A few days later, I received another message. This one from an old vendor contact I hadn't heard from in over a year. His company had B and burned by Halston Crest in a previous contract dispute. He'd seen the news. Now he was asking for help auditing his new partner's contracts. Wanted someone with an eye for shadows. I smiled. Word was spreading. We were becoming known, not for flash, but for clarity. For seeing what others missed. For paying attention. Peter, Carla, Nadine, and I met that Friday for lunch. A real lunch, not a strategy session disguised as food. We laughed more than we talked business. Nadine brought a bottle of Prosecco. Carla toasted. "Tamira," she said, "who taught us that quiet doesn't mean powerless?" I held the glass, the bubbles catching sunlight, but I didn't drink just yet. Instead, I raised it and added, "To truth, and the long road it takes to get there." It was raining the morning I walked past the old Halston Crest building. Not on purpose. I wasn't there to haunt the place or to gloat or to relive anything. I had an early meeting at a new client's office across the street, a startup specializing in clean freight technology. Young founders, hungry to do things right from the start. They'd hired Vera Point not because they were in trouble, but because they wanted to avoid it. That had become our niche. Still, I paused for a moment outside the building where I had spent 2 decades of my life. The awning was different now. Updated branding, the company's name stripped down to just Halston, like removing the rot by rebranding the structure. A weak attempt to signal change without accountability. The lights inside were dim. I recognized no one. That was fitting. That world didn't belong to me anymore. I didn't linger, didn't feel the need to. It had been 7 months since the first indictment. 4 executives had been charged. Mark Thompson had taken a plea deal, but only after a second set of financial records was discovered tied to properties and assets hidden in 3 different states. Shelley Barrett's trial was ongoing. Unlike Mark, she wasn't going quietly. She'd hired a high-profile defense team, released a public statement denying knowledge, blaming inadequate internal controls. Carla and I read it together one afternoon, passing it back and forth like a comedy script. "She thinks she's the victim," Carla muttered. "She thinks she can rewrite history," I replied. But history had already been written. In court filings, in testimonies, in every dotted line she signed without asking a single question. I testified again, this time in open court. There were cameras outside, reporters in the hallway, people I hadn't spoken to in years messaging me on LinkedIn to say they were watching. Afterward, I sat on the steps outside the courthouse and let myself feel the quiet, not triumph, not revenge, just closure. Vera Point grew faster than we expected, not into something bloated or impersonal, but something trusted. Our client list expanded, startups, nonprofits, mid-sized businesses navigating growing pains. We didn't advertise. Word traveled. People wanted truth. They just didn't always know where to find it. I kept my role small on paper, managing partner, but in practice, I was still who I had always been, the one who caught the little things before they became big problems, who trained the team on values as much as procedures. The person people called when something didn't feel right, even if they didn't yet know why. Sometimes they cried in our conference room. Sometimes they came in angry, red-faced, shaking, after being overlooked, ignored, manipulated, and I would sit with them and I would listen, because I remembered what that felt like. One evening, I was closing up the office when I got an email. It was from Emily. "Myra, I wanted you to know I left Halston last month. I finally realized I couldn't keep pretending it was the same place." It wasn't just the fraud. It was how easy it was for all of us to say nothing when it mattered most. "I think about the day you left, How I looked away, I still feel ashamed. I'm working at a nonprofit now. Logistics for emergency medical shipments. It's hard, but it's honest. Thank you for showing me what courage actually looks like. Emily, I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. Then I closed the laptop, locked up, went home. I still think about who I was that morning in the glass conference room. Myra Ellison, 47, Senior Operations Coordinator. I wonder what I would say to her now. Would I warn her? Tell her what's coming? Urge her to run sooner, speak louder, trust less? No, I think I'd just sit beside her, quietly, and wait for her to realize that the thing that broke her would also remake her. On my 50th birthday, Carla and Peter surprised me with a small celebration. Just the team. Nadine brought cupcakes from the bakery I used to stop by on my way to the office all those years ago. They handed me a gift, a silver pen engraved with 3 words. You paid attention. I held it for a long time before speaking. I didn't do anything special, I said. Carla looked at me. You did something most people are too afraid to do. You stayed when it was hard, and then you walked when it was right. That night, when I got home, I sat on my balcony again, city lights blinking slow and steady, like they were waiting for someone to notice. And I thought, they tried to end me with a box and a lie. Instead, they gave me a beginning, not the one I asked for, but the one I needed.